Clausewitz angemahnt hätte. Ein tiefes analytisches Verständnis, gepaart mit strategischem Verständnis, basierend auf einer sehr tiefgreifenden, langjährigen Erfahrung und all das zusammen akkumuliert und in eine Qualität der Politikberatung überführt. Das ist eigentlich das, was wir auch unserer militärischen Führungsausbildung als Teilkomponente angedeihen lassen sollten oder wollten. Herr Professor, darf ich Sie um Ihren Vortrag zu dem von Ihnen vorgeschlagenen Thema ersuchen?
Good afternoon. I'm delighted to be here. Let me speak about strategic thinking in the age of cultural wars, cultural conflicts, cultural confrontations. And let me start with everything that we already know about it and then try to proceed in a direction of how to deal with these problems. Recent conflicts are not the kind of conflict that we need to deal with, become more and more cultural conflicts in the sense that they're not between countries who are similar in terms of what they bring into war. In other words, the kind of established states who go into war with their military might, who have an economic infrastructure, who have a social structure that is tested in time of war. We have a new kind of war that is with us a few decades, but it becomes more and more different than the wars that we used to have in the past. And for us, we have a very new challenge, and the challenge becomes very embarrassing because we have very different societies on both sides of the front. And these societies are different not only in terms of what they bring to the battlefield, but in terms of their essence. We have on the one hand open societies, usually with a very robust military, economic and social structure. And on the other hand, we have totalitarian, very often, or at least authoritarian regimes, very often with a tribal social structure from what we call the Third World, and they're very often dysfunctional societies. So in terms of the old system, we should have taken the overall strengths, the overall potential of one side, and to say this structure is so powerful that it must overpower the weak, the dysfunctional societies, the tribal societies, and the outcome should have been that the stronger societies, the better functioning societies, the open societies will determine the rules of the game on the international scene. But what we see is a very, very different reality. We see a reality where radical elements, very often with a tribal background, very often completely dysfunctional, manage to prevent other much stronger societies, not only from getting their project, their policy successful throughout the world outside their own home area, but even the reality inside the areas where these functional societies, open societies, democratic societies exist, namely in Europe, in the United States, in Israel, in Australia, wherever you have societies that are well functioning, you have the challenge coming from the outside, and this challenge, in spite of the fact that it seems to be very weak, manages to disrupt life in Europe, to disrupt life in the United States, to present challenges to open strong societies of a kind we would never have expected if we look at the potential of the parties that are involved. And what gives the weaker, dysfunctional, authoritarian, very often tribal societies the power to do it to much stronger societies is a profound cultural change that happened in the open society. And we are just beginning to deal with this change, and particularly with the consequences of it, because what we see is that the weak societies use the cultural change that happened in the stronger societies in order to weaken the stronger societies to a point where the weaker societies can determine not only, again, what is happening throughout the world, in the third world, in Asia or in Africa, but also what is happening in Europe, in the United States, in Israel, in other places where you have an open society system. And the kind of cultural change that I'm speaking about has to do with taking the norms of liberalism and all the very positive things that are associated with these norms to an extreme where it brings it ad absurdum and in some cases to a pathological point. And it's not only that it is happening, but we, the open societies, have not fully recognized that this is our problem. We are in the midst, we are only beginning to recognize that this is our problem, and therefore we have not yet constructed the instruments that we need in order to deal with this new challenge. And if I may take the previous century as an example here, I would say the following. It took a long time in the previous century, in the 20th century, to recognize that such ideals that are basically positive, like patriotism or equality, can reach a pathological stage, as they did with fascism on the one side and communism on the other. It took us a very long time, and we paid a very high price until we recognized that we are facing a new challenge, where values that are basically very positive, and I think patriotism is a positive value, it's allowed even in Europe to say that, or that equality is a positive value, you can say it even in capitalist countries, but once you take it to the extreme that Stalin has taken it, or the fascists in Europe and in other places have taken it, there is something that is a profoundly new challenge that took a long time for societies to recognize and to prepare the instruments to effectively deal with it. I think that similarly now we are in a situation where some elements among liberals, and I think the Americans have a very good term for it that I will come to in a moment, have taken liberalism with all the very, very positive elements of human rights and equality and willingness to recognize the other and what have you, to a point where some of them have taken it to a pathological stage that is undermining the ability of the open society to defend itself. In the United States, they have a very good term for it, unfortunately not used enough, but I think it's there and it should come back. It's the difference between liberals and knee-jerk liberals. Knee-jerk liberals, as the knee-jerk physically, it is something that doesn't go through the brain. People say something automatically without thinking about it, like the knee-jerk. And when you're just taking a whole package and you're saying, if somebody says A, he must be B, C, and E, and therefore illegitimate, you're not thinking about it and you're letting others distort your liberalism. And again, this was recognized in the United States by some liberal thinkers in a very early stage. My favorite quotation, and I don't think anybody here will guess who the person is that said it, power corrupts. Weakness corrupts absolutely. I think this is one of the most brilliant statements that I've ever heard. Power corrupts, weakness corrupts absolutely. Adlai Stevenson. And he has another definition that I think also gives us a very good insight into this phenomenon. He said a liberal, and he meant a knee-jerk liberal in this sense, a liberal is a person with both feet firmly planted in the air. And again, this comes from Adlai Stevenson, perhaps one of the most interesting speakers for liberalism. At least I must admit that I would accept his values as a package deal, and I could very easily go with it. And he recognized that there is something that even liberalism can be distorted. And As much as people did not believe or found it difficult to believe that equality can be distorted, the way we've seen in communism and in the Stalinist version of communism, and we didn't expect patriotism to be distorted to the point of reaching the terrible crimes of fascism, in very much the same. Some of the liberals, and let me be very clear, not all liberals, not liberalism, but liberalism taking to its extreme, which is much more popular today than ever before, in recent decades than ever before, can reach the same pathological state. And the problem is that the radical elements from tribal societies, dysfunctional societies, people who don't share any of the values of the liberal structure and are the enemies of liberalism in the final analysis, because if they get their way, liberalism is out of the way. They have identified the weaknesses of this new kind of liberalism, and their whole war against open societies is focused on some of the problems of this extreme kind of liberalism. What are the weaknesses that they have identified? First of all, it is very difficult for open societies to deal with problems and serious problems that are acute over a long period of time. The idea that we very often are attracted into is there is a problem, we will find a solution, and then things will be very good. We have in Israel a saying, and I have it as a mark on my desk, a prayer: God, give me patience, but I want it right now. So this idea, modern societies who've solved so many problems through technology, and modern societies and open societies who solved a lot of the problems of human confrontation by willingness to compromise. I mean, this is what the European project is about, and the greatest success that we've had in the world at the end of the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st century, namely the transformation of Europe from a place that had to face bloodbaths again and again, becoming peaceful. All of this convinced us that when there is a problem, we will put our minds to it, there will be a solution, and then things will be over. Unfortunately, it doesn't work this way anyway, and societies in the West, open societies, expect it to happen. So all the radicals have to do is to present us with problems who have no solutions, and with struggle that goes on more or less forever. Let me tell you, terrorism that we are facing today, anybody who believes that there is a solution to terrorism simply doesn't know what he is talking about. I mean, I wouldn't even waste time to try and convince people. It must be so obvious that we are speaking about something that is profoundly different from what we've seen before. Because when we see people coming from Asia or from Africa and they have demands and they use terrorism, we assume that it is a new manifestation of the old colonial problem, where there was a solution. They wanted the colonial powers out of their country. Once you give them what they want, they will leave you alone. This was the perception. And very often, they're trying to cheat us as if this is the kind of demand that they have on our society, but the more you learn their ideology, the more you take their ideology seriously, and the more, and that's the most important part, the more you learn about their societies, namely what the discourse is inside these societies, you see that you have here something very, very different. Now, I'm not saying there are no cases of the first category, but the second category that I will speak about now becomes much more dominant. And these are societies who have an enormous motivation to hurt the successful open societies Not because they want something specific, not because they have a limited grievance, not because you've done something to them and if you stop doing it, they will stop it, but simply because they're unable, because they're unwilling to give a better life to their children. They're unwilling to pay the price of changing in a way that will make it possible for them to join the 21st century or even the 20th century. And therefore, rather than trying to give their children a better life, they're trying to give our children a worse life. And the assumption, and I'm delighted I'm speaking in a place where the German language is known, so I can use the term Schadensfreude. And interestingly enough, I only know two languages where this term exists, and this is German and Arabic. In Arabic it is Shamata, and in German, as I said, Schadensfreude. The idea is not, we will have a better life. The idea is, we will ruin your good life. And we will ruin your good life because we are not willing, not because we cannot do it, but because we are not willing to engage in nation building. We are not willing to try and give our children a better life being constructive. We will ruin yours, and this is what gives us the satisfaction. It is very interesting, and I can speak with some knowledge on the Arab world that I've studied for decades, that not only do people in the Arab world today know that they are the worst failure in modern history, and they say it very openly. When I speak on Al Jazeera in Arabic, I don't even know who's on the other side. I don't have a monitor. I have a camera in my face, and I speak, and my partner is in Doha or in Damascus or in London or in Vienna, I don't know. And when I say you're the worst failure in modern history, somebody on the other side usually says, yes, you're right, which was not the case until 15 years ago. There is a recognition that there is a deep failure in the Arab world, and interestingly enough, they know exactly what to do in order not to be a failure, only they're not willing to pay the price of doing it. They know that if they want not to be a failure, they need to embrace pluralism, including, and this is what makes it so difficult, equality for women. And they're simply not willing to pay the price to do it. And they're not willing to engage in the very hard work that you need in order to bring your society from the worst situation to the best situation, like you've had throughout the world, not only in Europe and America. You had it in Asia, you had it, I don't know, in South Korea, in Taiwan, in Japan, in Singapore, in Israel. You had it all over the place. People willing to work hard in order to be able to meet the challenges of the 21st century. But the challenge we are getting against our open societies come from people who are not willing to do it, and therefore know that they cannot provide their children with a good life, and therefore want at least to destroy and have satisfaction from destroying our good life, and unfortunately, they have accomplices in our own society. And these accomplices that I think it is attributed to Lenin, but I'm not sure he said it, calling them the useful idiots. The useful idiots are all over the place, primarily in universities, but all over the place. Being in university for so many years, I mean, I'm an academic, I look at my colleagues, I constantly tried to keep one foot in academia and the other foot in the real world. Because in academia, we have a problem of helping global warming. There's so much hot air coming from the academia that we might affect the whole global situation on the subject. And there you have the wise guys who will say it, but not only there. You have it also among journalists on a very large scale. Not all journalists. Some of my best friends are journalists, but only very few in this field. And we have it in Europe more than in any other continent as a general perception. Namely, people who say, well, you must go to the root causes of terrorism, to the root causes of these wars that they are waging against us. You must understand, there was colonialism, and there is occupation, and there is globalization, and look what we've done to these people. In the Arab world, you had 30 years colonialism light, only between the two world wars. This is really a very short period, and it was a very benign kind of colonialism compared to the colonialism that you had in India and the usurpation that you had in India for centuries. And look at the Indians trying and succeeding to build their society so that hundreds of millions are already in a position where they can meet the challenges of the 20th and the 21st century. And you don't have it in other places. You had colonialism throughout the world. Some nations decided to do something with themselves and to build nations. Others have decided to try to undermine other nations. So again, it is a cultural issue that we are facing. So the first thing they recognize as our weakness is our impatience to have a long battle where we should know that this battle is never ending. There is no such thing as an end to the battles that we are seeing today. The second thing is they've identified our sanctity to human lives, and therefore they're trying to kill both soldiers and civilians. And thirdly, and I think that this is the most cynical approach, they've identified that not only do we not want our citizens to be killed, we also don't want their citizens to be killed. In other words, they realize that for us, hitting their civilians is something that undermines our ability to deal with their militant provocations. So they work in a way that is designed to force us to make a choice between two things. A, to be completely unable to deal with their attempt to kill our citizens, or to kill their citizens, because the idea is not to bring missiles to protect their children, but to bring children to protect their missiles. So they plant the missiles directed against our civilians among their children in order to force us to make a choice that is a lose-lose situation for an open society. You either allow them to kill our children, or they force you to kill their children. And what they want is to bring the conflict to a point where we will not be able to deal with their challenges because our values that they don't share will stop us from being effective in dealing with them. And the third element is, because of colonialism that did terrible things for a long period of time, I don't deny it. But today, 70 years after colonialism isn't there anymore, they still harbor on this idea that every time you deal effectively with somebody who comes from Asia or from Africa, you are humiliating people in a colonial way. For instance, every time you have an Arab or somebody else from Asia or from Africa stop at a roadblock in order to find out if he has explosives or weapons on him, this is a terrible humiliation. But when each and every one of us has to come to the airport 3 hours earlier in order to get a security check because Arabs, more than others, and Muslims, more than others, made terrorism something that became legitimate in struggles, we are standing in the same lines, but we are not humiliated because we don't have a colonial past. So you have here this notion, don't do it to us, you're doing again to us what you did under the colonial period. And this is being used in a very effective way. More than anything else, they are aware of the fact that in a very simple-minded perception, there is this belief that all people basically want the same. I mean, you can hear it from, not only from academics and journalists, you can hear it even from leaders of a nation, and even from people like President Bush Jr., who was not exactly a humanist above everything else. But the notion, we're all the same, we want the same. No, we don't. If you start on the assumption that all they want is to live like us, then you start on the assumption that they want democracy. And then you bring democracy with the Marines. Or you bring democracy with a speech in Cairo that is very open-minded. So take Bush and take Obama. They suffer from the American malaise. I'll speak a lot about the European malaise. This will be the thrust of my discussion. But let me mention also the American malaise. Americans suffer from terminal optimism. They believe that all people in the final analysis have the American dream, and all they want is to be left alone to pursue the American dream. In other words, they're not willing to recognize cultural differences. The moment you speak about cultural differences, somebody jumps up, calls you a racist, and then you start apologizing. No, I'm not a racist, I'm not a racist. And the discussion is over. You're not allowed to discuss the most important issue of human affairs. Nothing is half as important, 10% as important as culture. And we don't discuss culture because anybody who discusses culture is accused of racism. And let me tell you from my own experience, since I discuss only culture, or culture more than anything else, somebody jumps up, accuses me of it, and in the beginning I used to say, no, I'm not a racist, but then I came up with a better answer. I started saying, look, racism is my hobby. After 5 o'clock, I'm a racist. But between 9 and 5, when I look at reality, I judge the reality based on the reality. And now, of course, I'm not a racist even after 5 o'clock. But it was a better way of dealing with this stupid and dangerous approach that whenever you speak about different cultures, you're being a racist. Let me give you perhaps an example. If we will perhaps later all go to dinner, it's okay if somebody likes chicken and the other likes beef and the other is a vegetarian. I can even tolerate if somebody wants kosher. It's okay. I can live with it. But if we have a cannibal and he wants to join dinner, I want to know if I'm on the guest list or on the menu. In other words, I want to know what I'm facing because he comes from a completely different angle. And if I don't ask him, sir, when you say that you're a cannibal, do you mean me? Am I appetizing to you? If I don't do it, then I cannot defend myself. And this is exactly the trick, the dirty trick, the cynical trick of calling a racist anybody who discusses cultural differences. Let me give you something that is a favorite example of mine. Napier, the British ruler of India, once issued a decree forbidding sati, the burning of widows alive in India. So they came to him and they said, you cannot forbid it, it's a custom. And he said, you know what, you're right, it's a custom, I cannot forbid it. So the Indians have a custom of burning widows alive. We British have a custom of hanging people who burn widows alive. So you pursue your custom and then we will proceed with ours. Okay? This is my perception of multiculti. If you say all cultures are the same and let us be tolerant to every culture, I have a problem. Because a culture that treats its women like cattle, to me, is inferior to a culture that treats its women as equals. And I know that this is very unpopular to say, but I enjoy saying unpopular things, and I can promise you will have more unpopular things later. And if you bring liberalism to the pathological absurdum of what I mentioned when I spoke about the cannibal, then you lose your ability to defend yourself from people who manipulate your values without sharing them in any way. there is a tension, a structural tension between the needs of national security and the liberal values of the open societies. It is a structural tension that exists among many values that we cherish in an open society. And the question is how you manage it. And by the way, it changes over time. There is a constant discourse in open societies about the correct balance between the two. What these radicals that I'm speaking about are trying to do is to force us to consider it as a zero-sum game. Namely, every time we protect our national interests, we must be betraying our open society values, which is not true when you come even to the individual, let alone when you speak about whole societies. Every one of us needs to ask himself, am I willing that people will look into the privacy of my bag to make sure that I'm not bringing explosives to the airport and to the aircraft that I'm about to take to fly? In other words, we ask ourselves, is it a reasonable balance? Is it not a reasonable balance? Is it too much security? Is it too little security? Is it too much protection of privacy? Is it too little protection of? These are legitimate questions, but it is not a zero-sum game. And what they're trying to present us with is the notion, once you are willing to fight people that do this to you in an effective way, you're automatically betraying your values, which of course is not the case. And the challenge is to find, even under very strong provocations, a kind of balance that the open society can have between measures that are effective on the one hand and are acceptable to our value system on the other, to the point where the mainstream of a society can give them legitimacy. And if you want such a theory, this functional balance between the two, namely how do you keep the core of the value system even when you need to use instruments that are problematic in order to defend your vital interest, this is the number one challenge. And the answer to the challenge, and here I come to the great difficulty because there is only one answer to this challenge, is focusing on deterrence. Because if you look at every individual case, the open society is tempted and usually will choose the way of saying, well, it compromises our values, so let's let it slide. The problem of this approach is dual. A, the more you let it slide, the more you encourage the motivations of the others to do it because they can get away with it. And B, and this is the more sophisticated and the more dangerous element here, B, the more you increase their motivation to do it, the more you show them that they can get away with it, the more of it you will get, and then you will reach a point that you can no longer pacify, that you can no longer say, okay, I'll live with it, and then you will have to use measures that are much worse than the measures that you would have used if the things were dealt with effectively in the first stage. So the question is, how do you give them a compelling motivation to stop? And the only way you can do it is to think in terms of deterrence. And deterrence is a very difficult proposition to an open society, because we have this notion that our response must be proportional to the challenge. And to this issue of proportionality, I want to devote the rest of my discussion here, because I think that this is something that we need to discuss analytically before we are faced with a realistic danger. Here at the analysis, people who think about strategic thinking should discuss it in a systematic way, and I will do it in a moment. But let me come to another element which again is working in mysterious ways. We say the Lord works in mysterious ways, but also public opinion works in mysterious ways, and for many people public opinion is the Lord. Vox populi, vox Dei. Let me show the interesting paradox. If you are soft in the beginning, too soft, you must be soft anyway. But if you're too soft in the beginning, and the inevitable result is that the challenge will grow, you will lose the confidence of the mainstream of your political public, because they will say, my government cannot protect me. They cannot protect my life. And then the response of the society will be to allow political forces that will go to the other extreme. So what you have is the knee-jerk liberals encouraging the fascists, and the fascists encouraging the knee-jerk liberals. And again, I make the distinction here between liberals and knee-jerk liberals. And I think this is the greatest danger, and if you look at what is happening in Europe today, to me, this is the number one problem of Europe, the polarization of people on the deep left who go deeper into the left, and people responding by going into the deep right, and a polarization inside the society, when what you need in order to deal with these challenges is a very robust, middle-of-the-road combination of people who are looking at bringing together in a balanced way the needs of national security and the values of liberal society. Because if the fascists come to power, then the liberal values will really be in danger. So it works in a very roundabout, mysterious way. Let me emphasize one thing, because when I speak of deterrence, I don't want you to use the only word that I really never use, and I think it is the foulest word in the language of a strategist, namely solution. The notion of solution is the terrible danger. The idea is you find a strategy and then you solve a problem. Looking at the age of people sitting there and their gloomy looks, I assume that many of you are married. So you know that there are things in life that don't have a solution. We also should know from our experience that everything that is really important doesn't have a solution. Poverty doesn't have a solution. Communists try to tell us that they have, with the inevitable consequences. Crime doesn't have a solution. There will always be criminals. It's human nature. It can't be anywhere else. The question is not how do you solve a problem. The only thing in life that has solutions are crossword puzzles. Okay? So if this is what you want in life, do crossword puzzles. The rest, don't use the term solution if you want to be a strategist. When I hear a strategist use the word solution, I immediately say, thank you, it was very interesting, namely the euphemism for I don't think there is anything in it, and I have coffee. We need to realize that there is no solution, and telling the public, without his legitimacy, you cannot have any kind of strategy today. We are not in Clausewitz's time, okay? We depend on a very vibrant public opinion that is involved in real time in what we do. So we need it. And when you come and tell people there is no solution, they don't like it. Politicians don't like to admit that they have no solution. I mean, they are voted into positions. Sometimes they're stupid enough to believe that there is a solution, and sometimes they're smart enough to understand that the public wants to hear about solutions. But the discourse is about solutions. But this is the political discourse. It should not be the analytical discourse, the discourse of solution. Now, what is the problem? The problem that it is a very thankless approach. It is really something that is extremely frustrating, because the tough people will tell you, what do you mean there is no solution? They're trying to kill us. What do you mean there is no solution? You're being a defeatist when you say there is no solution. And on the other extreme of the spectrum, we will be told, what do you mean there is no solution? Are we doomed to lose our values? Are we doomed to no longer be a liberal society? What's the point of continuing to exist if we become barbarians like the people who attack us? And the people in the middle, namely the people in the street, I use the term people in the street because why are they in the street? Nobody wants to let them into his home, so they're in the street. The people in the street have no patience. They don't want something that works cumulatively over a long period of time. They want something that works. So you have to be very conscious of the fact that when you say there is no solution, you will be in trouble. But on the other hand, if you promise a solution, you will fail. So again, here is a tension, and you need to be able to deal with the tension because you need not only to succeed vis-à-vis the enemy, but to maintain the legitimacy in the mainstream of your society. And the question is, how do you find, particularly in Europe of today, a strategy that really deters the enemy? I find in Europe in the last 100 years very little serious discussion on deterrence on the level that is accepted in the discourse of the elites in Europe. But this was not always the case. Let me cite, and I think this would be the appropriate place to cite it, what for me is evidence that somebody in the more distant past was thinking of deterrence. Knabe sprach, ich breche dich, Röslein auf der Heiden. Röslein sprach, ich steche dich, dass du ewig denkst an mich. Not, ich steche dich, dass dir das ein bisschen unangenehm ist und dann wirst du das vergessen. Ich steche dich, dass du ewig denkst an mich. And when he says it, he goes further. Und der wilde Knabe brach Röslein auf der Heiden. Röslein wehrte sich und stach. Half ihm dort kein Weh und Ach, musste es eben leiden. That's deterrence. I don't need a lot of literature on the subject. Here is poetry on deterrence. That's the idea. If Knabe can get away with it, he will do it. If the other Knabes watching the Knabe do it will see that he got away with it, no Röslein. So the question is, how do you find deterrence? We are being told that you cannot deter these people. I mean, after all, they have nothing to lose. They have a lot to lose. After all, they're not afraid to die. Perhaps the suicide bombers are not afraid to die. Others are. And you don't always have to kill them. There are other ways that you can do it. What you need is to understand that the war will not end in the bunker in Berlin or in Hiroshima. This is over. These kinds of war are over. What you need is a conception of deterrence that is more flexible, less expecting less miracles, more modest. I know that it's very difficult for an Israeli to speak about modesty, and even by Israeli standards, I'm not considered modest, so it's very difficult for me, but I must speak about modesty here, and to tell you exactly what I expect from deterrence. Only two things. To bring violence down to a level that my society can live with, and this will be judged by my society. What is the level they can live with? And to know that it will erupt again, only to space out the eruptions. Instead of coming every 2 years, they'll come every 10 years. I need these 10 years in order to build my society. This is what I'm about. I'm about building societies. So I need to use the kind of measures that will space out the eruptions and will bring the level between eruptions down to a tolerable level. By the way, this is what we do with poverty. We don't eliminate it. The welfare state brings poverty down to an acceptable level of the society at that given time. This is what we do with crime. We don't eliminate crime, but if we have a very good law enforcement system and legal system, we can bring it down to a level where the society can live with it. This is what we're doing every day. So I'm suggesting a very similar approach to strategy in that sense. And the challenge, and here the cultural analysis comes in, is how to find things that are as unacceptable to the attacking society as their attacks are to the attacked society. And that I want to emphasize, and I think it is important to emphasize it particularly to a European audience. What we instinctively think when we speak about proportionality in response is the level of violence. Say if we have 100 levels of violence, so if they challenge us with 30 or 40 out of 100, we should respond with 30 or 40 out of 100, and then we will be proportionate. This is the best recipe for suicide. If somebody is stupid enough to do it, he will be obliterated. He will not exist. And let me explain why. For an open society, what the society is about is nation building, is society building. What we want to do is to have a better education system and a better economy and a better health system and a more flexible democracy and a more vibrant cultural scene. This is what we are about. This is what we get up in the morning to do. When you have the level of 30 or 40 out of 100, a society cannot build itself. Let me give you an example. In Israel, we had about 12 years ago a situation in Israel where Palestinian suicide bombers in the streets of Israel persuaded Israeli mothers and fathers not to send two children who go to the same school in the same bus, because the assumption was a bus will probably be blown up in the air. This is what the Palestinians not only do, but also consider to be legitimate, the whole Palestinian society. So if they blow up a bus, at least one of our children will survive. This is not an environment where you can build a society. This is something that you must stop, and you can't do it by being nice. I don't think any democracy has ever been challenged with the kind of terrorism that even comes close to what we've had. So I'm speaking also of personal experience in the Israeli context. But what happens if you respond with a level of 30 or 40 to the other society, and the other society is not engaged in nation building? It is not engaged in building anything. I mean, what this society, why has the Arab world failed so miserably in the last 100 years? Because in the last 100 years they haven't built anything. Look at the Arab world. Look at what they are saying about themselves. Don't take the judgment of a Western person. Look at what they say today in the Arab world about themselves. And it is a society where on a daily basis you have violence on the level of 30 or 40 or 50 every day between different segments of the same society, namely not at war with somebody else from the outside, but among themselves. And not only Sunnis against Shiites, but Sunnis against Sunnis and Shiites against Shiites and what have you. Everything, all day, inside families, up to the national structure. So, if they challenge us with 30 or 40, and we challenge them with 30 or 40, they won't even know that we have responded, because their everyday reality is 40 or 50 in terms of their domestic violence. And therefore, this is the best kind of war that they can pursue. You cannot deter them from it, because it costs them nothing, and it costs us everything. And the question is, how do you deal, what proportionality, because you need to introduce proportionality, but a different proportionality. namely the proportionality of the level of damage that you do to the society. You must respond to something that is intolerable to you with something that is intolerable to them. This is the key, and this is very difficult, and the distinction here must be on the cultural level. Even if you do it, and you do it very successfully, it is cumulative. You don't get an immediate result. And here is an interesting paradox. In the beginning of your response will have negative consequences. If you say, you had this violence against me, I will do this against you, because what you do hurts them, they want to prove to you that it doesn't hurt them, so that you stop doing it. So they do more. And you have to wait for the second and third and fourth time and have a lot of patience and say, I know what is doing to them. They cannot live with it. We have a difficulty in living with a long challenge. They also have a difficulty with living with a long challenge if it is on the level that is really intolerable to them. And then you need to persist with it for a long period of time. What is the problem with this kind of strategy that I've just outlined? There is only one country in the world that systematically pursues this approach. By the way, most people who pursue this approach in Israel don't know that they're pursuing this approach. This is, and I think among theoreticians I can mention it and people will understand. My comment on this very often when I speak to an Israeli decision maker is, Oedipus, Schmiedipus, as long as you love your mother. In other words, they know what they're doing, it's very consistent, but they've never called it a name. So I'm giving it a name, but it is very persistent in Israeli strategy. And it works. It works very, 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 very well. Let me give you a good example. Take the challenge we had 12 years ago, which was the worst we've ever had. We took very tough measures in the year 2002. The result is that for 12 years now, we have terrorism on a very low level. Will it erupt again? Yes. Will you need to take another action in order to bring it down? Yes. But did it give us 12 years and perhaps more? Did it give us 10 years in Lebanon? Did it give us 2 years in Gaza? Yes. Is there a better way? No. Is it painful? Yes. Is it pleasant? No. Is there any other way? No. So this is more or less the way Israelis are thinking. And what you get, and here is where Europe comes in again, this is something that Europe cannot digest. Because A, Europe doesn't have a challenge on this level, and what you have had, these terrorism acts in Europe, are a joke compared to the consistency that Israel is dealing with, that the Jews in this part of the world are dealing with for 140 years. We are speaking about generations, not something that started with the 67 occupation, not even something that started with the establishment of the State of Israel, because it is a part of what is happening in the Middle East, anyhow, between everybody and everybody in the Middle East. This is what the Middle East is like. This is what Arab societies inside are like. This is what they do to each other. You can't expect that they will be nicer to us than to their own brothers. This is the Middle East. So when somebody speaks about peace in the Middle East, I find that he has a very developed sense of humor. And when you have it for a long period of time and you respond in this way, there is a price, a very high price, but not high enough for Israel to stop. And here is where Europe comes in. European elites cannot understand this response. European elites demand, and I'm speaking from being in discussions with Europeans who demanded it in the name of Europe, that proportionality will be concerning the level of violence that we respond, namely a way that will defeat Israel in the most fundamental sense of the term. And the Israelis, and this is the interesting paradox, Israel with Europe has a problem, but not a dilemma. The problem is that Europeans can insist on their policies, and they can punish Israel for not pursuing the policies that Europeans want Israel to persist. So we have a problem, a serious problem. No dilemma, because listening to the Europeans is not an option. If you listen to the Europeans, for instance, if you would have listened to the Europeans, Saddam Hussein would have had a nuclear bomb, Assad would have had a nuclear bomb, and suicide bombers would be roaming the streets of Tel Aviv. Because every measure that we took to prevent it, that was extremely successful, was very strongly opposed by Europe. So there is a cultural difference here. And by the way, not only between Israel and Europe, but also between Israel, Europe, and the United States, which is why, with some exceptions, we enjoy enormous support in the United States and very small support in Europe. 2/3 of the American people, beyond my rosiest dreams, some even say 3/4 of the American society, supports Israel in a very robust way, because America has a different perception about the use of force than you have in Europe, and even when you have in the United States a European president, which I think is one of the worst things America can have. You can have very good things in America that we've all learned from Europe, but when it comes to the commander-in-chief being a European in terms of his basic identity, this is a problem, because Europe can be Europe as long as America is America. If America is Europe, Europe can't afford to be Europe, because there is no grown-up that will come and save Europe when the Europeans do the wrong thing for themselves. So it's a problem, and it's a very serious problem. But look at American public opinion, and this is where the question of legitimacy comes from. It doesn't come from the president. It comes from a much wider elite. And you will find the Israeli, the American, and the European approach very, very different because of the cultural component. One last word about it, and I think Vienna is the best place to use this term. When it comes to the ability to deal with such a complicated war, I will say the opposite of what I'm told was said here during the era of Franz Josef. I'm told, I'm not sure if it's true, you will correct me if I'm wrong, that the term was die Lage ist hoffnungslos, aber nicht ernst. When it comes to what we're dealing with, die Lage ist ernst, aber sicherlich nicht hoffnungslos. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor, for this outstanding presentation. Ladies and gentlemen, you see I haven't promised too much, so the floor is open for your questions. Please go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor, for a stimulating presentation. I know the situation of your country pretty well, and I understand that it is not too difficult for you to motivate your nation to protect itself, since you are faced with a day-to-day visible and tangible threat. That was our